I'd like to welcome Sahra Gibbon from Anthropology.
Hi everyone. The announcement of the first draft of the human genome in the year 2000 witnessed a number of hope-filled and promissory claims about how genetic knowledge would transform the future of healthcare. Yet there were other claims being made at the time as well. As Bill Clinton put it, one of the greatest truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings are, regardless of race, more than 99.9% the same. The findings of the Human Genome Project confirm what many had been saying for some time, that there is more genetic variation in populations than between them, that race does not map in any direct way onto human biological variation, and that in fact patterns of human genetic diversity are weakly correlated with racial and ethnic categories. For many, such findings confirm what was described as the death of race, which some argued must be thought of less as a thing in itself or something to be identified, and more a process and product of geography, evolution, culture, and history. Yet in the wake of the Human Genome Project, the 0.01% of genetic difference or genetic variation that does exist has become the focus of a great deal of scientific interest and investment. This includes diverse fields of population and medical genetics concerned with understanding evolutionary and migratory history, and how patterns of human genetic variation influence disease susceptibility or the efficacy of pharmaceutical drugs in a field known as pharmacogenomics, linked to the pursuit of what has been described as personal medicine. We are then, I think, in a curious moment in the wake of genetic research related to population difference, where the paradox of the existence and the non-existence of race is unfolding. Some social scientists examining these developments, particularly in the US, have suggested that we are in fact witnessing a new biologization or molecularization of race in attention to population difference across diverse fields of genetic research. They highlight the flawed use of self-identified ethnicity as a proxy for biological difference in genetic research, the dangers of conflating social and biological categories, and the slippage that can ensue between notions of genetic or continental ancestry linked to geographical regions and categories of race. The move towards population stratification in genetic research has also been linked to the development of racially inscribed market niches inside the pharmaceutical industry. And the case of Bidal, a drug specifically indicated for African Americans with congestive heart failure, is an illustration of this controversial developments. For others, questions of social justice are at stake. The reality of significant health disparities between different self-identified populations in disease incidence and mortality also propel and motivate genetic research. For some, this is an opportunity to investigate neglected biological and social dimensions of health differentials, with self-identified race seen as a flawed yet good enough proxy for risk in clinical research. As you might imagine, these are developments that have generated highly polarised debates and discussions, particularly in the US. But how do these new and emerging fields of genetic research play out in a context where there are different social and cultural histories of race, or more particularly when notions of race mixture dominate? How does this inform the way genetic research on race and genetic ancestry is taken up and acted upon? What new debates and questions does such research generate in these comparative contexts? The way that race, nation and ethnicity have evolved in the Latin American region has been well documented. It's often described in terms of the intermixing of three ancestral groups, African, European and indigenous, or in terms of populations emerging from three geographical areas during a period of frequently violent colonial and post-colonial history. The high level of miscegenation or mixed race unions, particularly in the post-conquest period, is well known, where they also developed a unique system of social classification linked to a principle of whitening, with Europeans and those who were whiter occupying a higher position. The hope was that through miscegenation, others could become whiter. Yet this highly racializing thinking was conjoined in certain regions such as Brazil in the early part of the 20th century by influential social thinkers who positively link racial mixture and miscegenation to nation building, and in particular the building of an anti-colonial national identity. The valorisation of race mixture have persisted in the later half of the 20th century, fuelling and informing a popular notion of Brazil as a racial democracy. Nevertheless, the last 30 years have revealed enduring and significant links between racism, inequities and class in Brazil and other regions of Latin America. More recently, a number of growing multiculturalist agendas have emerged to address persistent discriminatory practices, particularly in the context of education. Yet paradoxes abound here. Race in Brazil and other Latin American contexts, as anthropologist Peter Wade puts it, is both simultaneously present and absent. This is nowhere more evident in the context of Brazil, where the notions of race and even racism are often widely popularly denied, where mixture or mestiçagem is said to dominate, and yet where official census categories include 4 colour categories: black, white, brown, yellow and indigenous, and where there are in popular discourse said to be over 130 different words for skin colour. How then does this diverse history of racial classification, nation building and the paradox of race as an absent presence inform developments in genetics? Do we see the same molecularisation of race here as others have identified elsewhere in the context of genetic research? Of note are a number of growing population genetic studies confirming at the genetic level the high degree of miscegenation and hence genetic admixture in contexts such as Brazil. The emphasis here has been for the most part to show the poor correlation between skin colour and genetic ancestry, with studies consistently pointing to how those Brazilians who might self-identify as black or white are constituted by variable proportions of European, African and indigenous ancestry. Brazilian genetic research has sought to demonstrate at the molecular level the genetic heterogeneity of the population in both national and regional contexts, and thus to emphasise the uniqueness of the South American region. It's an emphasis which reflects and reproduces a history of genetic research in Brazil that has long been seen it described as a racial laboratory. The case of pharmacogenetic research in Brazil is telling. International dosing algorithms for drugs such as warfarin, one of the most widely used anticoagulants, routinely use race and ethnic categories to calculate the most appropriate dose. Such practices have been explicitly questioned by Brazilian geneticists as they don't take into account the biological diversity of the Brazilian population. In contrast to those dosing algorithms that define dosage on the basis of arbitrary race categories, certain high-profile Brazilian genetic researchers emphasise the clinal nature of human variation, best modelled, they suggest, as a continuous variable. In this sense, by placing miscegenation as the distinctive and central element in the biological formation of the Brazilian population, Brazilian pharmacogenomic researchers would seem to emphasise the non-relevance of race. In my own research on breast cancer genetics in Brazil, I've witnessed the challenges and discomfort researchers face in translating categories of risk linked to specific population groups. Ashkenazi Jewish women have one of the highest known risks of carrying a number of specific mutations on the well-known inherited susceptibility genes BRCA1 and 2 linked to an increased risk of breast cancer. These are commonly known as the Ashkenazi mutations. Yet such mutations have been identified in Brazil and elsewhere among non-self-identified Ashkenazi Jewish women, raising questions about their reputed origin and population-specific association. Knowing what kind of risks these discoveries constitute in a context such as Brazil is, as a result, challenging. And to give you a quote from one of the Brazilian practitioners that I've interviewed there, she said, "We're so mixed here, I think it's difficult to find a unique influence. There are lots of studies with the race component if you're African or white, but it's really difficult to do that here. When we use those models here to estimate risk, we never know what to calculate." The meaning of race in this post-genomic moment is a paradoxical one, where at the same time as we have announcements about the death of race, it is also in some domains, as Dilwana Fulwiley points out, being assigned by means of a substance discernible at the molecular level. Yet comparative contexts such as Brazil point to elements of a counter-discourse that would seem to make use of and challenge the globalisation of genetic research using racial categories. That achieving this goal sometimes looks a lot like the molecularisation of race mixture highlights, I think, the need to attend to the transnational collaborations that often mean incorporating rather than totally rejecting the terms of international research agendas related to population difference. At the very least, the cases briefly outlined here on pharmacogenomic research and the Ashkenazi BRCA mutations in Brazil should, I think, make us attentive to how different social histories of race and contemporary practices of genetic research in the global south, including South America, are informing and transforming race as a biosocial category. I'll stop there. Thanks.